so we finished talking about our basic layout of proportions. The goal now will be to review, make sure we have those initial steps solid, and then develop the next. So we began looking at this one, this front view as a nice example of our skull to the right. So what I want to do on this is the same build-up, sphere, and let's say center line or tilt. It's always nice when you can match those, but I'll always count on it. And still looking for the diagonals and the leans. Here's the development of the chin and overall face shape. I think there's a slight kind of lean to the neck, but you could see how I have a penchant for exaggeration. I also feel that the more you can exaggerate early, the better, because we're going to add quite a bit of information on top of these, which has the natural effect of stifling the exaggeration or the movement a little bit. Here would be now the brow. So back to that thinking about, cross, and I know I just gave you a bunch to think about or chew on with proportions. Just want to reconnect back with those early steps. Brow, center line, chin. What's the relationship to the ear? Well, the perspective would be that we're slightly under. That's most of what we did. And we looked at a lot of different views. So now how would proportions relate to this? Half base of the nose, half bottom of the sockets, half eye and keystone. The only thing that's important to me at this stage is that all of my lines describe a surface that's consistent with what was set up with the brow, right? So every line, if you kind of try to take the stock of what we've done here, is on the same arc, or they're all wrapping with the same surface. So in that sense, you always want these lines to be communicating across. In other words, I'm not going to be doing straights, right, or coming in with some more aggressive lines. Otherwise, we might start to lose some of that early curvature that we've built for that wrapping surface of the head. So it's really this simple for me at this point, right? These would be my guidelines for building the later scaffolding of the skull and architecture of the head construction. So halves, and then nose, chin. Take this space, divide it into 3 equal shapes or spaces using 2 lines. Again, it doesn't mean that you can't change, adjust. This isn't a universal must for all heads. It's just a place to begin. So let's look at 3/4. So how would I set up the same? Here's the build, straight, tilt. Here's my chin. Relate that back to the large sphere of the head, neck, offset axes in space or tilt for that ellipse of the neck, high to low. Here's my center line. Here's my brow line. Halfway is the nose. Halfway is the socket. Halfway is the keystone and eye. Thirds for the mouth. I could see, again, a prominence. I'm not drawing these in terms of, the early stage, but it's what I'm looking at, and it's why my lines are oriented the way they are. I think it's worth mentioning because there's always that disconnect in drawing. I want to be drawing the thing that I see, but I'm always making a drawing. You're never making the thing you see. So I think it's important at certain points that I make the connection as clear as I can for you. What am I seeing and how am I interpreting it? So that's kind of where I'm orienting this. Base of the nose, remember, was the area where that nose was closest or most flush. When I'm looking for this line, which would be my bottom of the socket, remember how interested or amazing I think that cheekbone structure is? Well, that's I can start to see that here. That cheekbone is also, in my opinion, the key to understanding age, right? Aging for me is really just the structural fat of the face. Your face, there's a lot of fat on it that doesn't come as a result of you eating too much or too little, right? When we have fat fall, it starts to put stress and expose those areas of bone, which instantly kind of produces that look or feeling of age. And when we're youthful and young, like think of babies, we smuggle giant apples in our cheeks. There's no presence of bone there. What I think is really interesting about this model's face is that keystone is pretty wide and a little lower. So maybe in my more direct proportion studies of this, I would even kind of squash or adjust for some of these proportions. But it's pretty close, right? It might be a little taller in this one here, but it's not far off the mark. And that is close to the center of the eye, just as a loose approximation there. And then for the thirds, I could double check here. I'm mostly looking for that kind of the parting of the lips. So that would be my line there. And then maybe we could say, well, his chin moved down a little bit. That'd be something to keep in mind for later. right, where I'm starting to think a little bit more concretely about molding this to match his face a bit more. Let's try here. So does this still work when somebody is looking up or down, right? Or there's no longer that nice, clean division of proportions? And the answer is no. You're out of luck. So we're going to have to learn something new. I think I'd like to see a neck more this way. Now that's the good thing about this is, regardless of how difficult the position is, I find that this always works. So even when I have a view like this, I don't have to change my initial setup of those proportion markers. What changes instead is the projection of the feature off the face. So the nose looks like it's different in orientation because the cartilage of the tip of the nose is closer to the eye. But what you'll see here is that the halves are still the same. They still work. So here would be that's the front of the face. So this is just all stuff from our last lesson. Here's the chin, where we talked about that canopy for the jaw. So I could see that here. I'm going back this way, and that creates, again, kind of looks like our keystone shape, like that trapezoid. It gives me my front plane, bottom plane, and then here would be where we make our neck. Brow, and this one is pretty close to the top. Maybe that's like up here. And then ears low, so my perspective will be like this, pretty extreme. And now we're ready for step 5, which would be proportions. So I have my brow, I have my chin, and if I start to look, so brow, chin, we just do a draw over here to see if we're anywhere consistent. Halfway, it's right on that mark there. So I can feel pretty assured that what I'm doing as far as my proportions is matching from just about any extremely foreshortened view as well. What I do want to get in here that I left out is my center line, and then again, half, base, that area of the aperture of the nose, that central area of the nasal spine. I gave you that little talk about the different shapes, so that's kind of what I'm thinking about. Halfway again, bottom of the sockets, complex and beautiful bone that ties the temple into the nose and mouth. That's where we would find some information about that placement. Let's see if we're right with that. Pretty close. Halfway would be the bottom of that socket. Halfway again, center eye and keystone. Looks good to me. Good enough. So there's my halves and then thirds. And this is the way I generally work. I like to go in a certain order because it becomes so repetitive that it is easier to associate and remember. So if I do the nose and then work my way up, half, 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 and then mouth and chin, I'm routine oriented. So it helps me remember if I do the same kind of series of steps in the same sequence. Let's see if it would work in 3/4 from above. So we'd have here, head, tilting, shoulder line, face. I didn't change too much about the shape or the placement for this one, the distance of the jaw from the skull shape. Here's a neck. Here's a stretch for the back of the neck. Remember our next placement. I would see the center here. So pull this line across the forehead, around where you would think the brow are, let that drop so that it's running parallel to the front of the face or tilt. And then we're slightly above this one. So I chose these views so that you'd get every angle of the head demoed or drawn. Now I have my brow. What we're going to deal with in our coming steps will be proportions that would be less reliable. Like, for example, the next step we'll look for is the hairline. Well, the reason that I haven't put the hairline as part of this is because it moves too much. But it's not as reliable a bony landmark as some of the other ones that we're working with. So I have to put that on a separate step so that I remember to be more vigilant or aware of it in terms of its placement and position. But if I go back, we say brow, chin. So don't get confused by the cartilage. It looks about halfway. I was kind of biased against the nose for a very long time. I think because it's really hard to draw. So I deliberately didn't like it. Then I read a great book called Breathe. I think it's by James Nestor, where he talks about how our capacity for breath and then our evolutionary habits of eating have made or are responsible for dramatic changes in our face. Early caveman human had a deeper breath, maybe from his belly, as a result of having a different diet, right? Because they were eating harder foods, which caused for an expansion of the palate, which contributed to a larger nasal aperture. And that today we eat more processed, softer foods, which has caused for a collapsing palate, which has resulted in a smaller nasal aperture, which has contributed to a longer face, or sometimes referred to as mouth breather face. So it's really interesting also to think about the qualities and the design of the skull as something that impacts the overall look and even the nose. I still don't like the nose because I think it's too hard to draw, but that's opened me up to the possibility of thinking about it more. Halfway again. So now if I look at this, even look at the contour. Look how different this part of the contour becomes where it pushes out like that. That's a result of that bone, that socket and cheekbone. And sometimes it's even fun to try to draw it in here. Like here's go back to that idea of the glasses. We'll come up with some perspective designs for this later, and I'll offer some different ones. As a preview though, this is something I've worked with more recently, like the last 5 to 10 years, but I started out drawing, you look at Andrew Loomis's book, he says, just take a rhythm from the top of the ear and draw it down to the chin. I thought that was fantastic for a while, and then I also began to realize that because I didn't back it up with my own study, that I thought the cheekbone started up here. So every approach has a plus and a minus. And so what the goal should be is that you kind of start to develop your own and have fun thinking of ways that the skull can become a different abstraction, a different language of drawing, so you could incorporate it into your own work. So here'd be that glasses idea I was referencing earlier. The other cool thing to think about here, again, just to nerd out on this bone for a second, is maybe you like drawing animals. This configuration for us gives us about 150 pounds per square inch in terms of our bite, which is pretty lame, right? Hippo being the strongest of mammals in terms of their bite. And what you can look at when you look at skulls is how these all change. Like a lion or a big cat, the cheekbone comes out here like some kind of suitcase handle, right? And so you fit a lot more muscle. But it's also why I introduced that idea earlier on the back of the skull, where the male might have a bigger kind of bump in the base of the cranium. Bigger bones always equal bigger muscles. So if I want to shift and adjust, maybe create some different character anatomy based on that, I can start to have a ideal or an average, like what I'm trying to show you here, that you could warp and distort into something different. So that's kind of me trying to think about the relationship of what I'm seeing to what I know or what I just tried to communicate. So we bring that over here. I know it looks simple, so I'm just trying to build an appreciation on your part for what it is, like how complex the meaning behind just the simple setup and orientation of those proportion lines might be. And then again, we could look down here. Do these lips part chin at the thirds? It's pretty close, right? Even though I think his chin might be a little lower. So I think there's nothing wrong with getting the drawing up and running with this. Would it work on, let's say this one where this guy's looking down? Absolutely. If not, I'm out of a job. So here's our tilt. Kind of lose the neck. It's all right, we dealt with that. And then shoulders up here. Here's my jaw. So here's my setup. That's my 3/4. Now, there's my symmetry line here. Now my brow is this, lower. Ears higher. So that's going to be my perspective. And then halves thirds. So let's double check. Does it work? So that's half. So where is it closest to the skin? There. Here's the half. So it looks good. Looks like it works. So let's just translate it over here. Half. 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 And remember, all my lines are trying to keep some kind of sympathetic arcing or curve so that I maintain the fullness of the form of the head. And then 2 lines to create 3 equal divisions. So lips and their part, and then top of chin. And then we're done. That one's good. So I think the hardest poses for me are always the ones where the proportion's on the line. Like it could go either way, or the perspective, either way. I don't know if I'm under, over. Sometimes I think I'm under the head, but then I see the top of the nose, or vice versa. I think I'm above the head, but under the nose. So these ones I think are always challenging. Not especially like foreshortened or complex or anything, so I included that one here. Just kind of profile tilt for the shoulder, maybe 3/4 for the jaw. There's the shape, center line. So now I know how much it's rotated or turned away from that front or 3/4. And then I think brow here. Again, I'm not looking at the eyebrow. I'm looking at that, the projection of the bone, that ridge. That's about there. Looks like it just barely under. So I would go with that, and then maybe even exaggerate it a little bit. So what do I have to do now? Well, I always like to make this also echo in that chin line. So that'll help me maybe just discern how much of that canopy I'm seeing under the jaw. Stretch, and then maybe a pinch here, and then halves, thirds. Nasal aperture, top, or that would be the bottom of the socket or top of your cheekbone. Remember how important that is for aging later. Here's the center of the eye and bottom of the keystone. Part for the lips, top of the chin, and that's it. So that one's ready to be developed. Profile, here's our head. Maybe this way, maybe this way. Jaw. So this is a cool one, almost at profile, but just not quite yet. I think we're definitely going to be underneath this. Brow to ear puts us under. So get comfortable drawing through. Remember all that stuff about the equatorial center of a ball. And then, notice some of the features I mentioned earlier. Lean to that proximal plane of the forehead, the development of the brow ridge as a bone pushing forward. One thing that's super important about the head as it starts to approach this angle to me is, from my gesture drawing onward with the body and the head, what's really important to me is rhythm and asymmetry. And so sometimes we forget that that also exists in the face, that the balance, that there's a natural balance to the way that bone and muscle moves. So profile, I'm always reminded of how beautiful that is, that we'd have our forehead out, socket back, nose forward, back, cheekbone forward, back, and then so we go right to the lips, that balancing act of form and position continues all the way down. There's never a vertical. There's just this beautiful cadence of one force kind of balanced and teetering off the next, and maybe we can add the eyelids as an extension of that kind of back and forth structure of the profile's balance. It's so easy sometimes to see it here. The reason I'm reminding you of it is it's going to be our goal to translate this in 3D, which is why I'm putting in some early work to do positioning, proportions, so that when the time comes to start to think about the perspective of the face, I have all of this dialed in. I don't have to worry about it. I can just focus on kind of these beautiful exchanges between perspective and 2D balance. So back to nose, chin, socket. So, young enough, our model here, that we don't see the cheekbone as much, but look at a slightly older model and what you'll start to find is a little cashew that develops. I think it looks like a cashew because all of my analogies are about food. So cashew, but what happens in the cashew is that the skin, the malar fat, starts to sag and retreat, right, because of gravity. So it exposes. Remember, the difference between aging is exposing or concealing the skull. Youth, it's concealed. Age, it's revealed. So this is the transition of that cheekbone. Right, so really important for that proportion. Remember that. So half, half, half. So it looks simple, but again, trying to point out the importance of some of these lines and how you can later take and really make an impact on your faces by thinking about what causes them. And then let's do the follow through on our underplane. Here's the stretch of the neck as it turns. This one reminds me of the David. It just seems like we've looked at that pose so many times, it just looks like that position for the head, neck, and shoulder. And here's a pinch. So again, my focus in this area is always, just like on the face, seeing what is the biggest issue and most important. The volume and direction of the throat, right? Even though I'm just as seduced by how cool the sternomastoid looks or the trap looks, it's awesome, right? But in order to draw those and have a fun time drawing them, I like to try to set this up. So that would be done. Would that work, or would our approach work here? So for under, let's move our proportion up. So I'm not going to worry too much about that static 2/3, 1/3. I'm going to move this closer because I believe the jaw is starting to come in front of the skull. I can wrap that here, do our underplane. The long-term goal for me in any drawing that is broken into a sequence of steps like this is that we start to, at a certain point, collapse them. Right? The more you collapse, the more economical you could be with line and what it means and how it contributes to the build of the drawing, the sooner you can start doing direct line drawings. where you just go right to the contour because now your line is informed and packed with all of this underlying information. It's not that people that do that, haven't worked through steps. It's my belief that they've just consolidated them all. So here's the perspective, center line, chin. All right, so this would be confusing. I'd be tempted to say, well, maybe it doesn't work. But here would be a brow, chin. What's changing, and it looks radically different, is the cartilage. It's the feature. It's not where it starts. So that's half. Socket's half. Eye and keystone are still half. They're just overlapped and foreshortened in or behind that cheekbone or nose. Right? But the basic grid that we are thinking through hasn't really changed. So we'd be ready to start working on that one. So let's also consider a back view. Our approach might not work because we're just not seeing the same degree, the same type of the landmarks. So it probably wouldn't be the case that I would always use the halves and thirds, but I wouldn't totally count it out. So let's just take a look at this one and see what we could do with it, how you might want to approach it. So again, these are my angles. I know that could be hard to connect with here, but that's what I'm thinking. The neck is doing that. I'm thinking the shoulders are doing this. I'm thinking the head is leaning that way. And that's, how that's not different than the way I just talked about the profile, is that asymmetrical balance of, one thing against another. Aesthetically, a theme in a lot of my drawings is just that asymmetry. So now what we're going to do is add our faces, or our face. Here's the front plane. It's overlapped, but let's draw through. Right, so this is my average, just for clarity, my average shoulder line. It's an abstraction. It's a simplification of what the shoulders are doing. Common question I would get is like, well, does that mean it's this part? Or which part is it? It's none of them, right? Which is, I know that that's confusing. But remember, this is the distinction I tried to make earlier between the drawing and the thing that's being drawn, that they're not the same. There will always be a gap between those things. This is part of the drawing, or the instrument of the drawing, producing the line that shows a tilt, which is an average through that area. But I'll build to that later. So next, well, maybe we could do the neck just as a way to get comfortable with that pinch and stretch. So here's the connection. Here's the stretching. And then I know that my brow, so I could see, now right? Why is that bump there? That's the brow. And then the ear is here. So maybe I could use that now. Right, so I know a little bit more about that proportion. So that to that is high to low. So that would be my indication for the perspective. Maybe I use those points as a way to start to develop my ellipse now. Right, so that would be under. I think it's under at about that angle. So just to make that clearer, I think it's here. So we're seeing the head tilt away. But, think about if you were to just find this plane and drop it in the same way that we have for the majority of our build-up and last lesson. If I draw through and know that the chin is there, why couldn't I use the same proportion markers? Halfway would still be the nose, right? So that would still be here, assuming that, when the jaw ends, it's somewhere behind the trap and the scapula there. And then it certainly works for this area. Halfway between the base of the nose and the brow is the bottom of the socket. Halfway between the bottom of the socket and the brow is the center of the eye and the keystone. So I still think we could really benefit from that here. And drawings like these, whenever I have that extreme kind of turn or slight suggestion of profile, the way I would develop this anyways is hold on to that line and then build and subtract form. So if I just build form here, I'm just thinking about this being a landscape really. That's now the brow. Let's subtract some. This is the socket. Where's the socket end? Oh, yeah, right there. So that's useful. And then we could just couch a little eye shape in there. I'm losing some of this, right? So because primarily this is, look how much of that cheekbone. So that cheekbone starts to build in front of a lot of that information, kind of clouds most of the nose. And then I'm only kind of seeing a little nose shape down here. So I think there's still the application. You just have to get a little bit more creative with how you start to see it and in what facet. And then, not that we would need it here because we're starting to draw it, but that would be the area in front or behind the musculature of the body. Right? So if we start to put in contour shapes, it's clear that we're not going to see all of that. But drawing through would be the suggestion here. On the back view of the other example, we talked about squaring off the base of the skull or the back of the head. That's just I think it's a nice way to show a difference in texture, that's really square and broad. So I'm just basing that, kind of like the hairline here, and then bringing that up to show. So there you go. That's just about every view in terms of a turnaround of this model's head from that front view in terms of the symmetry and the breakup of the proportions, and then how I've just kind of moved it and nudged it to match all the different angles, which still apply regardless of how foreshortened that face ends up getting.